If it's Paul, and if it's a letter to the Corinthians, it's a pretty good bet that whatever he says, there's a controversy in the church he's addressing. And as we've seen, sometimes his answers are time-bound, while at other times his answers are absolutely timeless. This is true of today's passage from 1 Corinthians. There is a controversy lurking beneath his words, but his answer is absolutely timeless. This is the Apostle Paul at his very best. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, March 30th, 2022. As I do from time to time, let me begin with what Paul actually says. Then I'll reflect on it for a few moments. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed," and no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the discernment of spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. It doesn't take much imagination to discern what the controversy was that Paul addresses here. It's one that occasionally even raises its ugly head today. That is, some people in Corinth believed that because they had showier, flashier gifts of the Spirit, they must be spiritually superior to others. This goes right along with what we know about the Corinthians. Issues of status loomed large in their minds. This actually continues a topic we saw Paul take up yesterday, but which we didn't name because I was focused on a particular element in yesterday's reading. The overarching concern has to do with the conduct of worship in the Corinthian church. Yesterday we saw Paul raise the issue of how women and men should be dressed, or rather whether or not their heads should be covered during worship. And then he addressed the issue of how to conduct the Lord's Supper. The section I just read now begins an extended discussion of the manifestation of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church, especially as it relates to worship. And as with men's and women's proper headgear and the proper way to share the Lord's Supper, this discussion addresses a source of controversy within the church. This reading today sets out a general principle which Paul will draw on later, but the principle is so important that it can almost stand on its own. Indeed, we read this passage today not because of any controversy in the church, usually, but simply because it casts such a powerful vision of the various spiritual gifts we have in the church. The contrast in what he says is between the idea of varieties of gifts and the idea of one Spirit. His point is as obvious as it is profound. All of the various spiritual gifts we bring to the life of the church are gifts of the one and the same Spirit. Therefore, no one can claim superiority over another. For example, it's easy to think that because I have the gift of preaching, a gift which forms the focus of our weekly worship, that my gift is the most important one. Nonsense, says Paul. The gifts of teaching, of preaching, of serving, of caring are every bit as important as the gift of preaching, even if they are not as publicly manifested. Let me say that differently. The life of the Christian community is made possible by the Holy Spirit. Jesus promised the apostles they would receive the Spirit as God's ongoing power and presence in the church. Apart from the Holy Spirit, there is no church. But it's not just that the Spirit is present with us in the church. The Spirit equips the church for its work of witnessing to the redeeming and reconciling love of God in Jesus Christ. And the way the Spirit equips the church is by equipping its members individually. It is when we all bring our gifts to the table that ministry actually happens. And we need every gift we can possibly get. Some of those gifts happen to be more visible, some less. But their visibility does not make them more valuable, nor does their lack of visibility make them any less valuable. All are gifts of the Spirit, and all are necessary. So there's no use in bragging about what great gifts we have as opposed to someone else's. There's no hierarchy here. It's a lesson the church has to learn with each new generation. Tomorrow, Paul presses his point, comparing the gifts of the Spirit to the parts of the body. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.